Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always fun to give this type of presentation because hopefully it shows kind of what can capture you out there in nature. Because when she was rattling off research expertise or things we might do, you know, the path to get there is kind of winding at times. And so some of what she talked about, we've got some work going on where I could take a clip of your hair and tell you what you've been eating. That was the biogeochemistry part of some of it, right? But when we say a lot of the questions I ask, I'll use reptiles and amphibians as my model organisms, okay? And for a number of reasons that hopefully become a bit clear, other than they're really cool. You know, I kind of fell in love with them. But aside from that, there are some relevant reasons. And so that's some of where we're just back at the basics then, right? Kind of the fun stuff about some things that are out there in the world that we may not know are so prevalent around us. And so often we refer to this group, you know, the hidden biodiversity around us. You know, what are those things in nature? It's really tough for us to realize they're there sometimes. And so that's kind of where we pick up today, and you'll kind of get to feel like you're back in school. Because often when I'm presenting this, I have lots of questions for you, just to make sure we've got everybody on the same page, especially when we've got such a nice age range in here, right? And so you're about to get quizzed for a bit, right? But then we've also got points at which we'll turn it over to not only talking to you what's around you, and examples of what are around you, because we've got plenty of animals, believe it or not. And we've got some snakes and some frogs and some turtles, some salamanders. You know, we've rounded it off, believe it or not, it's all up there. Okay, yes. And we do. And we've also got, we'll change your mind a bit here. But we've also got a bunch of the equipment we would use, because if it is hidden biodiversity, right, it's not super easy to just necessarily walk out and decide you're going to find it or study it. So we've got standard tools, standard trapping techniques. So we've got a little bit of everything here that helps us as we work through it. You decide what you want to see the most of. We've got enough person power where we can have stations with the gear if you want to learn how to pit tag a snake. Our volunteer. Okay. And so, but we also, if you'd rather, you know, see a bunch of the animals or rotate among, we'll, you know, be happy. Questions later, stations later, however you want to work it. But in terms of just some of the nuts and bolts, what's an amphibian?
Land and sea.
Is it land and sea? Oh, I'm asking. This is how I teach. It's called the Socratic method of teaching, where I always do. So I'm sorry. Definitely not meant obnoxious. Ask them. It's a standard part of just who I am. But when you look at that, are these all amphibians? They actually are, right? And I would imagine we picture frogs. So we have our frogs and toads, right? We have our salamanders, right? What in the world is that? It's actually not a snake, because believe it or not, a snake and a lizard, they're not amphibian. That is actually a caecilian. A caecilian. Okay, and so even within amphibians, but if we're thinking amphibians, remember in general, we're thinking, right, very delicate skin, that moist, thin skin, right, and no scales. Okay? And so with caecilians, they should maybe remind you of some snakes, etc. But if we start talking that language of reptiles, okay, what's going to be different between the amphibians and reptiles? We pick up the scales. We pick up the amniotic egg, a slightly different physiological and developmental part, shall we say, right? But if we start thinking then about having your frogs and toads, so your neurons, okay, having your salamanders, having your caecilians, which are Gymnophiona, but then we start thinking about reptiles. Oh my gosh, when you start looking at their diversity, but in any case, you're going to start seeing scales on these guys and a number of changes or differences between the groups. But with reptiles, we've got turtles and tortoises, okay, and there's Dr. Horn with a friend of his. He's got a pretty cool job at the San Diego Zoo. doing international turtle work. Hard life, right? We have our snakes and our crocodilians, so an alligator. Do you like how I got that example too in one picture? Where the alligator's chowing down on a snake. Okay, and so you have it kind of, yeah. Yeah, center in on that one just a little bit. And then we have our lizards. I put up a colorful one you probably haven't seen around here, but you would just be blown away at the diversity of colors and body forms and shapes out there of these creatures. Now here all of a sudden, what's that? No. Nope, and iguanas would fall in with our lizards. That's a very good guess, right? But what if I said New Zealand? Everyone got quiet. Everyone want to go to New Zealand? What if I said third eye? I'm not talking a horror movie, right? That is a tuatara. There are only 2 species in the world. It's its own reptile order, okay, the Rhynchocephalia, right? But you have tuataras, you have lizards, snakes, crocodilians, so alligators and crocodiles and caimans and all, tortoises, turtles. When I say tortoise, that means it's what? Spending most of its life on land versus those that like water. Then check that out. Remember how y'all gave me funny looks about the Sicilian? What's that? No? Good guess, though, because you're actually thinking without limbs but not a snake, right? That is an amphibian. I'm for real. I'm not making it up. But it's an amphibian. Worm lizard. And sometimes they're worms, that type of thing that they call them. But it's not a lizard. It's not a snake. It is a squamate, like lizards and snakes. But it, too, is a different taxonomy. Look at how it has its scales are arranged in rings around it. So you have annuli of scales. Physiologically, the lung that is shrunk down is different in an amphibian. It's the right, whereas in a snake, it's the left. Things like that. So there are differences for the classification.
How big is it?
Now, most of them are little. Some of them can get a bit bigger. And the cool thing would be, when you're looking at this, do you see how it has the reduced eyes, all of that sort of good stuff? And you look back to this sort of thing with reduced eyes, where do you think both of those like to live? Underground. One may be more moisture than the other. And then all of a sudden you start thinking hidden biodiversity, right? So even for the things we would be aware are around us, oh my gosh, all those that we're not aware of. That, pretty cool world out there. When it comes to vertebrate classes, the most speciose, so the group with the most number of species would be the fish. Right behind them, we have the reptiles, particularly the squamates, the snakes, lizards, and amphibians. Okay, and so that's kind of the group. But now the kids in the audience, can they tell me about this? That says, what do they have in common? Yeah. So what's that? So T-Rex, right? Do you have to worry about a T-Rex tonight? No. Okay, because the T-Rex is what? Extinct. As is the golden toad. Okay, and so when it comes to what they have in common, and so when I start talking to a group about hidden biodiversity too, maybe there can be a point education-wise too, right? Is to start getting the word out about what we have out there, because the sadder part of it is what we have disappearing, right? And so here, when you start thinking about numbers of extinctions, amphibians as a group are one of the groups disappearing the fastest on the planet, right? And so this is what hit the news then. You've probably heard this more, global amphibian decline. Well, the issue technically is we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We're losing species on the planet fast, so fast that they say this is the 6th mass extinction event on the planet. One of those extinction events took out the dinosaurs. The one we're in, they're saying, is largely our actions on the planet. But overall, the blanket is calling it the biodiversity crisis because all groups were losing species fast. Amphibians, one of the fastest, right? And so all of a sudden, global amphibian decline started hitting the news. And you could start looking at causes. And this is kind of a color-coded map where the more green you are, it's because of habitat going away. So habitat destruction. The purples and blues, they're being harvested for medicine, for food, but an over-harvesting situation, not like managing for deer, right? And then there's this huge bubble, the pinks and reds, where they're going and they haven't even been able to figure out why. Right? But it was an issue and is an issue of global scale. And so when the work started, what we saw most on the news were the deformed frogs and all. That's what would have been most in our face as this was coming to play out. But there are many studies that have linked it to a variety of things. So it's not just one thing. Well, the catch was amphibians got all of this attention, but you know what? She talked about me doing my postdoctoral work at Savannah River Ecology Lab. Well, Whit Gibbons was my postdoc advisor. Okay, and so this was a paper they put out in bioscience where they actually said, hey, hold on, deja vu. We can start talking about global decline of reptiles too. But it's not just these groups, but when we're talking about reptiles and amphibians, they are disappearing fast. And so then the thought is, and you can only imagine, depending on the audience, where this question goes with the should we care. Okay, and for time's sake, I kept this very short. You just see 3 bullets up there. And so when you're looking at it, there are, you know, as a conservation biologist, as an ecological physiologist, things like that, maybe the first thing my brain goes to, ecosystem function. Right? When we talk about how the world around us works, we get a lot of ecosystem service. We need clean air, we need clean water, yada, yada, yada. Right? Well, if you think of a forest around here, the bulk of the vertebrate biomass in the forest around you, okay, not deer. Like if we caught up all the deer, dried them up, measured the biomass left, they're not the bulk of the vertebrate biomass in that forest. It's salamanders. Imagine that. And how many salamanders have you seen in your life? Okay, and it depends on, in this part of the world, y'all probably seen more than some. You know, when I'm teaching a class, a good number of those students haven't ever seen a salamander. But see, up in this neck of the woods, y'all are in one of the salamander hotspots in terms of diversity on the planet. Right? So you have probably seen some salamanders. But in a forest, and particularly drop down to Spartanburg and all, even our state salamander, the spotted salamander, a lot of folks haven't ever seen it. It spends most of its time underground. But in a forest, the bulk of the biomass, salamanders, imagine what role they have in ecosystem functioning then. Decay and recycling of nutrients, food chain dynamics, all of that, right? So there are all those kind of answers. Now, the second one, I have a specialty. You know, I've worked with venomous snakes for a long time, particularly rattlesnakes. And a lot of times, you know, people will be watching as I'm giving a talk, and one of the questions would be, why in the world would you work on a rattlesnake? Or why in the world do we care? And that one's a fun one, because first of all, we get a lot of our medicines from wildlife, including reptiles and amphibians. You know, some of the skin secretions, skin chemicals in amphibians are 200 times more powerful than morphine, right? But even when it comes to creatures near and dear to my heart, you know, the rattlesnakes, if any of you are on integralin or have a family member that is on the heart medicine integralin, that is built after a protein in pygmy rattlesnake venom, right? And so you don't know as we lose things what you're actually losing. If we got to put it in terms of what we literally as humans are losing, right? And then here again, we can bring it back to humans. Now, you have to come on in, don't be shy. When it comes to thinking about the importance or should we care, have you noticed a theme? Because I'm about to talk to you about bioindicators too. All of a sudden, went away from thinking about ecosystem function to telling the world what? Why it's important to a human. Okay, because a lot of times I have to make that case. But please do know, I know I have to make that case. I actually fall into that camp. It's kind of okay for other things to share the planet with us. just for the sake of sharing the planet with us. I hope that's just understood, right? But when it turns to things we literally get, the ecosystem functions in terms of clean water, clean air, things of that, medicines, right? And what we have often is they can serve as bioindicators for us, right? You know, you heard canary in the coal mine, right? You felt kind of bad for the canaries they bring down in that coal mine, right? Because they would what? They'd die just before a human would in terms of air quality, and the humans would know, get out of there. They were a warning. They were a bioindicator. For many reptile and amphibian groups, they are the same for us. Okay, for instance, what Kip and Manette and Melissa have worked on some at the Savannah River site is looking at mercury levels in a green water snake. Green water snakes could be the largest water snake in North America, all that. Why in the world would mercury levels in a green water snake mean anything to you? Turns out green water snakes love to eat what you love to eat, bass. They're fish specialists, right? They're top predators like us. Do you imagine folks are fishing in those ponds and all too? Possibly eating those fish? So, you know, we've got some of those snakes that are off the charts for mercury, right? That can actually give you some indication of mercury pollution in a system. Have you been around ponds and all where you see, don't consume the fish, mercury too high? Unfortunately, we're seeing that more and more and more and more, right? But some of these animals that you would kind of shake your head at, you know, like, I think I'd be happy if the planet didn't just have them. Sometimes maybe that's our gut response, but we don't ever quite know, right? Literally what we get from them. Even though, like I said, my hope would be there's some of us where it matters even more that they might keep sharing the planet with us. But there are a diversity of reasons of why we should care. Now, in terms of how we might see them, if it were an amphibian, I mean, you've got all kinds of, you've got the tiny little tadpoles, the bigger tadpoles, right? You like those, huh? And then, you know, a nice toad eating. Don't you like that projectile gluey tongue? Some of the Pac-Man frogs, if they get your finger when you're trying to feed them, you can take your finger and pick up a piece of loose leaf paper because the glue is that powerful. It's kind of impressive. But you know, again, your salamanders, you've got some that still have their larval gills, things of that. So you might actually see them, but you might also see their egg masses. You could actually walk around here, your vernal pools, right time of year, your ponds, you know, your lakes, and look for egg masses. They're species specific. So if I'm doing an egg mass survey, I'm walking around, I see this and say, okay, you had some toads here, American toads, right? So I can actually do a survey of an area, and part of how I could link it to what's there in terms of amphibians is by knowing. We've got wood frog, leopard frog, pickerel frog, green frog. Some do clumps, some do sheets, some do strings. Isn't that kind of cool? That one, the spaghetti, and then that's narrow-mouthed toad. So the gastrophyni, the ones that, I almost did it for you, but we'll play real sound files in a bit. They baa like a sheep, kind of gets annoying in terms of their call, because here is where we could say we also could hear them, right? Because when it comes to anurans, the frogs and toads, each one has their own song, and it's only the boys that sing out. They get to a pond or a creek, wherever they want to breed, you know, the right type of breeding habitat, and the boys start serenading, right? And sometimes hundreds or so at a time, and then the females come in to choose, right? And so each of those calls is species specific. Keep in mind, anybody heard that before? It's one around here. What is it? I mean, Leslie showing you the picture of it. Isn't that amazing? The evil part of me plays this one when I'm having my students ID frogs by call, because it kind of sounds like it's laughing at you. So, what am I? You know, that type of thing. But any guesses? And so we have the leopard frog. Okay. You've got tricky ones here. You have a pickerel frog here that almost looks identical to that. There's a difference in the spot patterns, but it snores. Like, picture the worst snorer that's aggravated you. That's what that frog sounds like. So if you're driving by a pond or something at night or your window's open and you hear a lot of snoring, it's the pickerel frog, not the leopard frog. Okay, but it's kind of handy that you can sort of, by their song then, start figuring out what you have in an area. And some of these really different. So we have the Spadefoot toad, which most of the life of this toad, it's underground. They're what's called an explosive breeder when we get heavy, 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 heavy rains in South Carolina, in the right part of the state, right? So just south of where we are in Spartanburg. Heavy rains, the ground just comes alive with them. And they go en masse to where they're breeding. And you notice it breathes using its vocal sacs under throat. This one right behind the eardrums, so different placement of. But hey, we can hear them. When it comes to a reptile, my fear is the most common ways you've encountered them would be seeing them on roads, would probably be my guess when it comes to reptiles, right? Or basking, catching some rays. That would be my best guess. For, hey, you've probably seen some of these things, right? But often they're catching some rays or they're crossing somewhere where they're really putting themselves at risk. Okay? Not just from people who don't see them, but people who see them and like to want. Skish them, right? So that's a risky, risky adventure. But then I like to have fun. See them really? And I gave you easy ones. But this is one of your pit vipers around here. So one of your venomous ones. And so when we say see one real, remember we've got a good number of them that rely on camouflage. But hopefully, what?
This one's good.
It's an easy one. It is a copperhead, right?
Really?
Yeah, right there. It's coiled right there.
Really?
Yes, sir. And sorry, I had too much fun with this. What was that? Was it Where's Waldo or whatever when you were growing up? I was one of those that loved that, so I probably have too many of these in this. But copperhead there. Now, something else that's really special about your pit vipers around here is, yes, sometimes they coil like you would expect in that last one, but sometimes they do this thing called leaf hiding, which is really aggravating because they already blend in pretty well. But any takers on this one? Can you point to the head? Now you're wishing you chose the front row, aren't you, sir? Right there. That's the head, and that's its body. I'm not lying to you, I promise. And we can pull these back up. Isn't that amazing, though? And so you can see here, head, and then the body with the scales running that way. Okay? Another one? This isn't a copperhead this time. What type is this one? This is another venomous pit viper. He's looking at you. See the adorable pygmy? I started with Pygmy Rattlesnakes. They are near and dear to my heart. Isn't that adorable? But what they'll do is, is the rest of its body's coiled under those leaves, and often it's just a spot showing. I was radio tracking a 5-foot timber rattlesnake in the Ozarks before, where I knew the thing had a radio tag in it, and coming up to where it was, there was that much scale showing, and the rest of it was just under the leaves and all. Yep, so leaf hiding is a popular thing. This one's easy. This is one of those, right? The beautiful timber rattlesnake. Yeah, look at that. You see, aren't they beautiful? And so anyway, you also we've got all kinds of ways reptiles and amphibians could be truly referred to as hidden biodiversity, right? Now, remember, even for the reptiles. They're not quite as famous for being able to hear them, right? The rattle, probably the famous. And we could show that and show you some rattlesnakes rattling, but also some black rat snakes and all that tend to rattle to scare you to death, even though they're not venomous. But the bottom one with the hiss will get in them both. Watch closely. Well, it will. Hear the rattling? See the tail? No, and that's the beauty of it. Why I would say you could hear rattling or hissing. We know that rattlesnakes are venomous, right? But the black rat snake, or the pine snake in that case, which you have in South Carolina, you have them real close, that type of thing. The hissing is a bluff, but pretty effective, huh? I mean, those can be big animals. You want something that big hissing at you like that? And then you saw it rattling its tail real fast. And if that's in leaves and all, it's even louder, where you think, oh, wait a minute, is that a rattlesnake? And so you can actually hear rattles. Hear rattles, hisses. There are geckos that chirp. There are gopher tortoises that grunt. So there actually are some sounds, but the reptiles aren't as, famous for the sounds they make. Now, in terms of how we would work with them then, to try to figure out what would we even have in an area when half of what we could be looking for is truly hidden, if not more than half of it, right? We have some standard techniques where we would use drift fences. So you have Jared and Lauren next to, it looks kind of like they're at a construction site, doesn't it? Some of that silt fencing, buried in about 12 inches. And along the length of that fence, you have funnel traps. We got a snaky already. Okay, we have funnel traps. We have pitfall traps, which are literally 5-gallon buckets sunk in flush with the ground in that fence. And let me tell you, I preferred installing drift fences in Florida to up here. Florida has sand. You do not. To dig a hole the size you need for a 5-gallon bucket flush with the ground and a fence, I don't like it, okay? My students weren't overly fond of it. I forgot to put in the collage of them installing ours. And then the beauty was we get ours up and running and travel over to Davidson where the students promptly say, oh, our facilities folks put it in for us. And mine looked at me and I'm like, y'all know how to do it now. And so, but we could use drift fences where if an animal hits that fence and goes to go around it, if it's larger, it goes into a funnel trap because the funnels actually back up flush to that fence too. If it's smaller, it hits the pitfall trap, ploop, plops in, and we've got it. See the little toads? You can get salamanders that way. You can get a variety of things in your funnel traps. This size funnel trap, I've caught everything from the size of a baby pygmy rattlesnake, which coils to the size of a quarter, all the way up to a 5-foot timber rattlesnake. And any manner of, I think probably strangest capture was a possum. I prefer my rattlesnakes. I don't want teethy grins like that coming back at me from that. But so we've got drift fences. We've got aquatic minnow traps. Okay, and so, yes, sir. It was, and normally I have some sort of shade over them. You saw kind of the black tarp and that one. When I've run them in Florida, it's a palm frond. So I was just lifting the palm frond thinking, what herp am I going to have in there? And Nice thing is they're fairly bear and alligator resistant. I've had the bears sit on them and squish them, right? And I've had alligators try to pull them in the water, but they don't seem to like the metal, which is handy. Because then the metal reef smooshes back out. Because you often don't have a whole lot of money for doing this kind of work, you can imagine. But we've also, if you're a fisher person, like to catch, I'm going to choke myself, there we go. If you like to, catch your bait fish or whatever, we actually call these aquatic minnow traps. And they're one of the most effective ways for catching aquatic snakes, but also things like tadpoles, obviously catch fish too. They're what we would call a self-baiting trap because they get tadpoles and fish and stuff that's And so at one of our sites, we needed to surround an entire Carolina Bay to get sampling across the whole bay. So it took 500 and some traps to do that. So you see JD and Chris holding up what we had to go set up out in that water, right? And JD's holding a bunch of our haul from one day, which are a bunch, aren't they beautiful too? Black swamp snakes. Okay. Black swamp snakes that have brilliant red belly and all. But they can actually, you can catch quite a few using these. But a standard technique, we've got some. We can talk to you more about all of these when we're finished, whatever kind of interests you. Hoop nets. Okay, works kind of similar to a funnel trap. Works kind of similar. But obviously, now we can start getting things like big old snapping turtles and a lot of the sliders and things like that. So they're often for, whoops, but they're often for turtle sampling in deeper water. But again, regardless, when we're setting them up, just like with the aquatic minnow traps, right? You cannot have it to where they could smush all the way under the water, or you'd start what? Drowning things. And so when you look at Naya and Jared setting that particular hoop, do you see how the openings would be under the water, and then it's tied off sturdy. So then if something heavy got in, it wouldn't tag down because you don't want to drown things. Same thing with your aquatic minnow traps, or if you're using a funnel trap as an aquatic, a larger version of that, you have to be really careful with depth of how you would set them up. Now, cover boards, that's where some of these can come in handy. You have to be very careful, but plywood is kind of a herpetologist's friend, as are sheets of tin, because you can actually set up cover board arrays if you needed to sample an area. This is something I would love to do at Walnut Grove. But basically, every so many meters along a gradient, usually like habitat gradients or whatever, you could put out plywood sheets. I often like to do plywood sheets with tin sheets side by side in a dual array stacked moving down, because reptiles tend to prefer the tin while amphibians tend to prefer the wood. And so that way you're doing some sampling that way, but you basically put them out. You can put all kinds of things like temperature sensors under them if you want to link it to something physiological, but then you literally go out and flip the board up, catch what you got underneath. You kind of want to do the flipping with something like this, and you want to flip kind of towards you so that you're not doing this and something not so nice might be coming out at you. So you want to be strategic. If it's just you and you're concerned about actually catching it, you would do it from the side. And then if it's not venomous, you can jump on it and you've got it. Venomous, you have another set of tools. Are you giggling? Now, remember, call surveys, we do have those vocalizations we can use in breeding seasons for frogs and toads, and there actually are standardized protocols for doing call surveys. Another version of that, if you wanted to survey a wetland through time and there could not be a body out there every day, right? What you end up doing then is you can put frog loggers out. Okay, and so you have basically battery powered system. Your little sound cards go in, it's got some microphones. You set the program for how often you want it to record through a day. You go out and retrieve the sound cards. And so for scope, one of our systems way out in a wetland in South Carolina, or we might have to canoe to them in high weather, and you notice that's an ice, that's fun, right? And then sometimes it gets rather deep. But what we can do with some of this, especially if we get individual recording, so Adrian has what we call a shotgun mic, and if you get in the wetlands at night, and so wetlands in South Carolina are hot. You see the sweat when we're in our waders in that wetland. But the thought would be find calling frogs so that, and so where did I get this working before? So I've got one, well, I've got several of those to show you tonight. That is a green tree frog. We've got some in the house, okay? But why its eyes look like they're glowing is, remember, this is nighttime. These things tend to call at night, and that's all we had out there were our headlamps. So that's our headlamps kind of lighting that up. Adrian's down close to it with the shotgun mic. So you can imagine us in a wetland. There are hundreds of them going. You have to train your ear to finding one that is calling. And then be patient if you make it shut up, and get the shotgun mic fairly close to it and let it start going again. Because then what can happen is, let me get back to, okay, so you saw us getting ready to do that. And what we're able to do back in the lab then is bioacoustic analysis. We could actually physiologically break down to you things about that species call, frequency, pulse, etc. And what Elliot was able to do is build a computer recognizer that could scan all those thousands and thousands of files we were collecting from the wetlands, run it through his recognizer, and pick out the files where we had a particular species calling. Pretty cool, huh? Yep. And so, and then I'm not going to put it back on full slide because we're almost done. Pit tagging. We've got a pit tag system over here if you would like to learn to pit tag a snake, in this case, a fluffy snake, right? But that gives us a way we want to follow or be able to recapture animals through time too, depending on the type of work. And you basically just take a glass encapsulated copper chip, hypodermic needle, microchipping. If you've microchipped your animals, it's the same concept. You basically take it about 2/3 down, bloop, and then you can scan it and you have a permanent number. Okay, so we have ways that way. We also can radio track if we need to follow them around, where if you look at the turtles up here, there's a radio transmitter epoxy to its shell. Turtles are easy. You can epoxy. Basically, it's a battery pack that beeps at a certain frequency, just like your favorite radio station would have. So you can wander around with an antenna and a receiver that's programmed to that station and find your animals. So turtle's easy, you epoxy it on. Frog's a little trickier because they can wear a little harness of it. Okay, you see it right off the back. Okay, snakes have to do surgeries. So that's why you see kind of the x-ray back here in the last third of the body, right? You do a small incision. You've coated your battery pack in paraffin, something that doesn't react with body tissues. Make your incision, slide it into the body cavity, not just under the skin or to push it back out, right? You thread hollow tube the other way for the antenna to lay flat under the skin. And then you suture it back up, okay? Now, I'm thinking we want to switch to animals soon, so I'm not going to show you this video. But if you would like to see radio tracking or how that works, if you put in Pilgrim, Massasauga rattlesnake, so that's a mouthful, but Pilgrim, you're going to pull up a YouTube video, okay, that is me radio tracking Massasauga rattlesnakes out in a Missouri prairie, an endangered rattlesnake where they needed to know if they were leaving the refuge, how far would they move. So if you want to see that or some of the other techniques in action, just Pilgrim, Massasauga rattlesnake, there's a YouTube video that will show you how that works. And then at this point, what we're going to do is take some questions before we can fan out and show you techniques and animals. Some of the animals we'll start with here as a group. Some of them are easier for us to break out into stations here in a bit. But for the snakes, we'll have you seated at first for the bigger snakes. Okay, and then we'll see who's comfortable with what. Bless you. But first, any questions? So you've seen an assortment of things we can do out there to find them, follow them. Some thoughts on what we have around us. Anything I've brought with us is stuff we've just caught yesterday or the day before to bring to you. So there are things you can encounter. But any thoughts, questions, concerns? Yeah?
So what can we do to expand the population?
For a lot of them, I'd be happy to just maintain. At this point would be good too. What would you imagine the simple things would be? And this is where, I mean, think of Conserving Carolina. Well, reduce pollution's a give me, but also what's Conserving Carolina doing? It's protecting space, isn't it? And it's protecting natural space, right? Isn't that not a huge thing? When one of the things I showed you on that list feeding into decline is habitat destruction. You can only imagine if a habitat no longer exists on a planet, then whatever was using that habitat is effectively what? Gone, unless there was some other it could potentially use. But for some, as that disappears, so I mean, even think as, you know, sometimes it seems like it would have to be something grand. But a lot of times it's choices we would make, and some of them can be, you've got a lot around you where you have folks that would be interested in those things too. But obviously reducing pollution, obviously conserving space, land, you know, that type of thing. Thinking about invasives, things of that nature. And so that green tree frog you saw, that shouldn't be in our neck of the woods, by the way. Our tree frog should only be the gray tree frog up here. The green tree frog, it's common in low country, not up here, but now it's the easiest for me to get for these shows, for these programs. So it is up here now, but we can talk about possibilities of why. Some of that could be climate stuff because they are in low country, right? It could be just a northern range expansion, but then also tree frogs like to hitchhike with us. So they'll get in our vehicles and everything, and for all we know, it would be a cool phylogeographic study to actually see genetically, are they coming up from their northern range limit, you know, expanding that, or are they finding urban heat islands like Charlotte or whatever, where they may have hitched a ride with us and it's warm enough then for them to come out from a city. Would that not be a cool project? Do you see what I mean? So there are lots of possibilities there, but the green tree frog, you know, native to South Carolina, not exactly to the Piedmont. Isn't that weird? Just kind of that thought. But others, yes, sir.
Salamanders, you mentioned that they are the vertebrate that is the most.
Oh, you have some of the most.
Where else do you see them other than, I only think of them as being in streams.
Oh my gosh. So many underground. Right time of year around here, and you'll have to visit us. Maybe that would help, or we have to figure out where you might have a migration here. Enough rain, the first rains, warm rains, as the winter is ending and you're heading into spring, the state salamanders for South Carolina come up in mass from the ground, and they're doing sort of a mating or productive migration to pools. You usually see males hit first, and you can see their spermatophores. It's external fertilization. The females come up and pick up the spermatophore, things like that. But a lot of them are underground. A lot of them are in, you know, you might see, you know, some in ponds or rivers, especially if you're thinking newts. A lot in your creeks, right, in your mountain creeks and all of that. But also some in the mud. I don't know if you've ever heard of an amphibian, or can you picture an eel, or like a Congo eel or something? Just slimiest snake you could envision, in kind of a jet black to gray, that big. Weirdest, so I'm saying weirdest a lot, I guess one of the weird things. We got an amphibian 2 summers ago in one of these. And they are a giant salamander that spends most of their life in the mud, literally, of wetlands. And this thing was doing something weird where it had grabbed its tail in its mouth, and it was spinning in circles. Any thoughts to why? It's kind of fun, this stuff. But why do you think maybe it was doing that? So needless to say, you've got giant salamanders that will spend years down in mud. If that wetland dries, they can estivate and be down there for years, okay, till it fills again. Yeah, no, you've got some cool stuff going on out there with these. But any ideas as to why it was doing this? Yes? No, you have another question?
Is it trying to maintain its temperature?
Our running hypothesis is the thing that loves to eat those is called a mud snake.
Oh, okay.
And it's really hard for a snake to swallow a circle. Yeah. You know, So our running thought was, because we catch mud snakes in there too, so we wonder if it picked up the scent. It's just, we don't know. That is purely speculative, but it crossed my mind. Kind of cool. But what was your question?
I was just curious how much species diversity there is on campus at Upstate.
Oh my goodness. Melissa's like, yeah, she's kind of like, did she really ask that? Well, we have tons of. If you ever want me to send some of our formal stuff, let me know, because we've got their formal posters and stuff. But a lot of what we are bringing, we didn't want to keep it in captivity too long, so the 4 of us, we were out, day before yesterday, and caught what we have for you. But we are,
They're not moving.
what was that? They're,
Those specimens, are they alive?
They are alive. They are alive. I did put them in a nice cool container getting them here. But why would they not be moving, first of all, in air? Some of it can be shy, but how are they really different from us? They're ectothermic. So their body temperature changes with that of the environment to keep them less stressed. That's part of why y'all probably recognize the bag that's insulated. So we'll see. You're going to stay there still, but you know it's going to mean the snakes are going to misbehave here in a bit. But we're somewhere between 50 to 100. Probably right. Yeah, no, it is pretty awesome. What I look for, one of my questions on my interview, because even if I'm teaching labs, I like them to be outside as much as possible where they're collecting their own data relevant to what we're teaching. And one of my questions on interviews is, how far is it to green space? And Dr. Newberry, some of you know her. I was all in dress clothes for the interview, and I said that. Not only did I see the green area on campus, but she had me hiking in heels around Peters Creek Preserve. So needless to say, kindred spirit, right? And so, but we are fortunate to have access to so much near us. Other questions? Okay, now we're going to start with the ones that might throw you off the most, right? We're going to get some of the bigger snakes out first. We'll show you leg whipping, which is how for a non-venomous snake, if you don't want to get bit and it's moving away from you and you have pants on and you do this gently, right? You would let it move in the back third of the body. You gently grab it, lift it up in the air gently, swing it in between your legs, and then thread it till you have the head. You laugh, but then it's at least biting your jeans and not tearing up your hands. You can imagine the look on my students' faces the first time that happens on a lab. But this is the fun part. And then if you look at poor Minette, I'm sorry to do this to you, but can you stand up for a minute? She's very tiny. They asked if we needed a kids menu tonight at the restaurant. So she is the first student. She is the first student. And when we went to teach leg whipping, she did it the right way, but she's so tiny it could still wrap around her. So needless to say, you want to make sure you do it in the right direction where the head's behind you, not in front of you, right? And you want to make sure you have jeans on and that it's not venomous, okay? The one, yes. This is a standard way for hauling a snake around. I know it seems strange, but you put them in pillowcases. And I was trying, if you have a lot of money when you're doing this, you do fancy pillowcases called parachute bags. So that would be the fancy version of what we tend to use. Regular pillowcases, they can breathe right through them. It lets you gently carry them and combine them. You know, we have them in a 5-gallon bucket here, so they can leak it here without getting smushed. And what you would do is just find the head. You'd untie it. I'm going to let them do that. That's why I'm not doing it right here. Kip. Don't let it run towards them. The pressure's on, but you can do it here maybe. I'll try to run interference. Manette or Melissa, get on that side, please. Yeah, she's finding. I know. You're feeling really smart right now, aren't you? We'll switch back there for the next round. It moves. But that way, if you get the head gently when it's in the bag, you've got that freedom to reach in then and not get tagged just reaching in blind. Yeah, you were watching that too, weren't you? Hopefully he's got the right direction. Isn't this nice pressure to put the students under? Okay. Now what he has, this is a black rat. When they're young, they're patterned. You can see that a little bit on this one. It still has a little bit faint. They're very patterned as a youngster and then get increasingly black. But that is a black rat snake, kind of medium size for what they would get around here. If I can just see the tail end for a second. You grab the middle. Yeah, yep. And then if you grab middle, if you handle the snakes, can you grab the middle? I want the tail. Oh, kill. And it's a boy. Okay, and I can tell by how thick the tail is, which we can show you that if you're up here. I do want to preface it, if you're going to hold the snakes, you're going to stink. Like if you're close, you will probably be smelling it soon. When they have musk glands down by where, and each species has a different smelling musk. I thought a fun test for them one time would be to put like on a Q-tip the different musk and see if they could do by smell which snake species, but do be prepared, you are going to stink. But we'll get these out in a bit for y'all to hold or touch too. But he will demonstrate the leg whip, presumably. Yep, and if you're squeamish, okay. And so the snake would be kind of moving. You can assume that's moving, Kip. You gently pick up in between, and then thread it out. And then you've got the head, and you didn't take a bite. And you don't do it hard, so you're not hurting the animal. You gauge it right to where you don't pound its head on the ground when you're coming in between your legs, right? That's not nice. But what he can do, if you want, okay, because we'll take out, we probably should do the water snakes first, then walk around the room with them all if you would like to touch them before we get to the much more friendlier things. So we're going to do that twice because we probably want all hands on deck for what's coming out next. He's not acting like a field herpetologist, is he? He's smelling his hands and going, cool. Are you saying, uh-oh? They're in pillowcases too. That's the way to haul them. Let's see if we can't get the big one. Not generally. The thought is it would stink things away, like it's a startle response, and it's not all over their body, but right near their cloaca where they would use the bathroom from, there are some musk glands back there. So I'm not sure if you were close enough, but it oozed out a little bit of musk. You can't blame it. A giant thing is handling it. You cannot blame any of these things for being a little stinky tonight. You know, I'm due, if there's such a thing as alien abductions, karma, I'm in bad shape. Just think, right? But so you can't blame them. Is that the big one? Get the big one. You can get the little one. Y'all can get them both out if you like, because we can show them the difference here too. One point I want to make with these is how many of you say we have cottonmouths around here? Oh, that's beautiful. Y'all are awesome. Okay? A lot of what we hear often is about all of the cottonmouths around people's ponds or lakes or creeks in this area. When we're down at SREL, Up here in the Piedmont, right? But we do have one of our most common water snakes is, you doing okay there? You sure? Not, these are all from the same area. So what they would be, nope, not for these. No, we're good. If we had a king snake in the mix, that would be, but we are not. Now, if you look at that, so one hand there, I know you don't want this. I know. Okay, now, we're And so, but it's important to show you this one too. But is that not pretty? But you have northern water snakes around here. And when we walk this one around for you to touch, one of us will have head and tail. And y'all can feel in here to also feel the difference between how a belly scale and the back scales feel. And why this one would feel like sandpaper, where some of the others we'll show you will feel smooth as silk. Aren't they cool? And so when we look at this, again, you know, if we were catching this, and this is the one we said was a go, right? Because y'all were probing that one. One thing we can do too, because sometimes we want to know, not just boy and girl, right? Which we can probe if you haven't been working with the species long enough to tell by the size. But something we often like to do too, you've got to be careful so they don't spin on you, but you hold it well enough that if you do this, and you take your hand with your thumb, your back is along the backbone, right? And your thumb in the middle, in between their ribs. You can palpate them, right? And up high, that's letting you check for food. What do you imagine down low? Babies. Why did some say eggs and some say babies? Some snakes lay eggs. These give live birth. But there are some babies in there. You can feel a bloop, 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 bloop underneath. Okay, so we have our northern water snakes, and that's just a smaller one, a smaller boy, and we've got an even smaller one in the containers, depending on what size. And I know you are going to want to touch. Is that what you've been? Are you okay? You okay with that? And so, real gentle. You just want to feel. Isn't that cool?
Soft and sweet.
Yeah, and you'll be able to feel more of them here in just a little bit. They're coming towards you. Do you notice that they're the ones that start asking first? Right, and so what we can do, right, is we can hand these off. We can get the rat snake back out, but if it's easier to sit for a bit, we can weave these around y'all. For those that want to touch, right? And then for some of the smaller, we'll break out into sessions. But you want that. And again,